Generally, I don't think a reading of history that emphasizes the actions of key individuals too much is a good or accurate one. I think there's generally something wrong with describing a war as the victory or loss of a general without including substantive acknowledgement of the thousands of troops that actually carried out the fighting. Moreover, valorizing these individual figures often leads to excusing their faults, waving away genuine decisions that figures made or values they embrace that contradict modern standards as them being men of their times. But Eugene Debs was different. He was an individual but never lived for himself. At every turn, he put his own interests on the line in pursuit of an undying dedication to the common collective good. And Debs never was a man of his times. He was a man against his times, one who stood for what was right, even when it was unpopular, dangerous, or futile. Part of the reason that Debs isn't a particularly well-known or celebrated figure is that ultimately he lost. For the most part, the beliefs that Debs dedicated his life to never came to fruition in the way he hoped they would, at least in his lifetime, and his impact on the modern world is difficult to tell. But maybe we can tell something important about American history, and the role we all ought to play in it, from Our Greatest Loser. Eugene V. Debs grew up in Terre Haute, Indiana, where as a young adult he found work as a fireman for railroads as a part of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. The Brotherhood was a somewhat more disempowered version of what we now understand to be a labor union. In his time at the Brotherhood, Debs believed that, quote, labor and capital are friends, and was opposed to more militant approaches like strikes. This belief started to change as capital became unfriendly. The growth of railroad corporations and their hostility to the Brotherhood drove him to change his stance. To Debs, a strike started to seem like the natural response to oppressive conditions and align with the American tradition. In his own words, quote, the nation had for its cornerstone a strike. But true representation for railway workers couldn't come in the form of the Brotherhood, which almost never authorized strikes and was more focused on creating community among workers than organizing towards better conditions. In response, Debs created the American Railway Union, the first industrial union in U.S. history. The ARU was put to the test rather quickly. In 1893, the Pullman Palace Car Company, which produced rail cars, cut the wages of their workers by about 25%, all while keeping prices for housing and other essentials in their company town of Pullman the same. About a third of the Pullman workers were represented by the ARU, and the workers decided collectively to strike with the knowledge that the ARU would support them. Debs also authorized switchmen around the country with the ARU not to allow any trains carrying Pullman cars to pass, obstructing the ability of 15 different railroads to operate. Nonetheless, Pullman management refused to negotiate with the striking workers, and the federal government became involved. President Grover Cleveland issued an injunction that made involvement of ARU leadership in backing the strike illegal, and sent in federal troops to break the strike. Debs didn't end his involvement with the strike, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison. During his first prison sentence, Debs became further radicalized. He read for the first time the works of Karl Marx, specifically Capital. This marked the most clear turn in Debs' thinking, from someone who thought reasoned, peaceful deliberation between labor and capital could bring about change, to an unabashed socialist who thought workers could never truly be free absent the abolition of private property. Socialism wasn't just a political ideology for Debs, but rather an extension of his personal ethical beliefs. In one speech, he said, "Am I my brother's keeper? That question has never yet been answered in a way that is satisfactory to civilized society. Yes, I am my brother's keeper. I am under a moral obligation to him, inspired not by any maudlin sentimentality, but by the higher duty I owe to myself." However, Debs differed from other Marxists in that he thought using democratic means, as opposed to revolution, would be the best way to bring about socialism in the United States. In 1898, Debs founded the Social Democratic Party of the United States, which would eventually become the Socialist Party of America. Debs would run for president 5 times under the SPA ticket between 1904 and 1920, garnering gradually increasing levels of support in each race. Debs offered a more radical alternative to the progressives of his time, and despite never gaining an electoral vote, still represented a voice on the public stage for the American labor movement. Debs' platform was one based upon the recognition of human dignity he espoused in his speeches, targeted at workers' rights, equality, and a decent standard of living for all. When America began to show signs of involvement in the First World War, few voices existed in opposition. Debs was one of those few, bringing a socialist perspective to America's role on the world stage. In 1918, Debs delivered a gripping speech to a group of supporters in Canton, Ohio, that detailed the socialist case against war. The master class has always declared the wars, the subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives, said Debs. Quoting Alfred Lord Tennyson, Debs called upon workers to reject participation in the war. "Yours is not to reason why, yours is but to do and die." That is their motto, and we object on the part of the awakening workers of this nation. For federal authorities desperately trying to rally public support for the war effort, these words were the straw to break the camel's back. Debs was brought before the Supreme Court and accused under the Espionage Act of sedition. Eugene Debs was never going to win the case. Instead, he used his time before the court to lay his ethical beliefs bare, and appeal to the nation that he still believed could change to become more humane. His statement included the following: Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class I am in it, and while there is a criminal element I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison I am not free. In this country, the most favored beneath the bending skies, we have vast areas of the richest and most fertile soil, material resources in inexhaustible abundance, the most marvelous productive machinery on earth, and millions of eager workers ready to apply their labor to that machinery to produce an abundance for every man, woman, and child. And if there are still vast numbers of our people who are the victims of poverty, and whose lives are an unceasing struggle all the way from youth to old age, until at last death comes to their rescue and lulls these hapless victims to dreamless sleep, it is not the fault of the Almighty. It cannot be charged to nature, but it is due entirely to the outgrown social system in which we live that ought to be abolished not only in the interest of the toiling masses, but in the higher interest of all humanity. Debs was convicted. He lost his citizenship, was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and most stingingly lost his right to vote. He continued to run for president from prison, receiving a career peak of 1 million votes under the slogan, Convict number 9653 for president. Eugene Debs was given every reason to give up on his hopes of a better world, but nothing deterred him in his fight for justice. Looking at the facts alone, you'd think Debs lost. He spearheaded a political movement that achieved no power of note. He spent extensive time in prison. He ran for president 5 times, and he lost 5 times. When he was eventually freed from prison, it was a pardon issued by President Warren Harding, who granted the pardon given that Debs was, quote, an old man, not strong physically. But what really does it mean to lose? Eugene Debs was unflinching. He knew what he believed in, that being the common dignity of all humanity, and he didn't move an inch. A loser would have given in to the federal marshals, to the prison sentences, to the Supreme Court, to the masses that opposed him. An individual that can face all of that, every structure in America that exists to oppress, silence, and beat down upon dissenters, that is a titan. And Debs didn't want an immediate result anyway, at least not towards the end. If you think he filled out the registration paperwork for his 5th shot at the presidency from federal prison with the expectation that he'd be elected, you misapprehend Debs. In the final paragraph of his iconic speech before the court, Debs described the socialist movement as sailors at sea. When the mariner, sailing over tropic seas, looks for relief from his weary watch, he turns his eyes towards the Southern Cross, burning luridly above the tempest-vexed ocean. As the midnight approaches, the Southern Cross begins to bend, the whirling worlds change their places, and with starry finger points the Almighty marks the passage of time upon the dial of the universe. And though no bell may beat the glad tidings, the lookout knows that the midnight is passing, and that relief and rest are close at hand. Let the people everywhere take heart of hope, for the cross is bending, the midnight is passing, and joy cometh with the morning. Debs's midnight has not yet passed, but 103 years after he uttered those words, the sun may finally be peeking out from beyond the horizon. In 2020, Democratic Socialist Senator Bernie Sanders came inches from the Democratic nomination for president. Nearly 10 million Americans backed Sanders as he conceded to now President Joe Biden. As a teenager, Sanders studied Debs's work closely, even producing a documentary on his political career. As of this January, the Democratic Socialists of America have 92,000 dues-paying members, along with a growing caucus in the House of Representatives. It takes a remarkable humility to give what Eugene Debs did for a future he seemed to know he wouldn't see in his lifetime. What Debs tells us about American history isn't something that was borne out through what he achieved. Rather, Debs' story resonates most strongly in what he didn't. Maybe if our reading of American history didn't focus so much on the winners, the Mount Rushmore figureheads that achieved era-defining glory, but rather the losers, the ones that laid their lives on the line in the name of love for their common man, we'd think differently about American citizenhood. The memory of Eugene Debs cries out even today for us to move beyond ourselves and to dream of something more than individual success. He tells us to center on the beliefs that mean everything to us and do everything we can to further those causes. There's a line from the conclusion of Debs' iconic speech before the Supreme Court that was cut out of multiple republished versions of the speech. I'm not sure why. Maybe editors thought it was a procedural phrase used in the courtroom rather than a rhetorical choice. I disagree. How Debs decided to conclude this historic, iconic speech, wherein he described his deep moral drive to better his common man, despite knowing true change could only be found on the horizon, speaks volumes about who Debs was and how he should be remembered. Eugene Debs said simply, "I am now prepared to receive your sentence."